In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to our study of the Acts of the Apostles. We're going to walk through Acts chapter 27. And actually, this is a kind of a difficult chapter to read through because it's recounting how Paul is going to take this journey all the way up to the southwestern coast of Turkey, and then go around the island of Crete, and eventually they will be shipwrecked in the island of Malta, which is off the coast of Italy, out in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. So he gets into a lot of details in regards to what happened during this journey and why they were shipwrecked in the island of Malta. And it's really interesting because it's all about Paul's journey to Rome. And what's really interesting is there's so much description about this incident at sea. It's a long chapter, but then when you read chapter 28, it tells you very little about Rome, and that's the very place where he would be imprisoned and eventually martyred. There's a reason for this because the concept here in Acts of the Apostles is how the gospel is being brought to the Gentiles. So let's go through Acts 27. And I think you're going to see something beautiful about how the Lord guides Paul during this journey, even as a prisoner. So, Acts chapter 27, it begins by saying, and when it was decided that we should sail for Italy. Now, this picks up looking back at the previous chapters. Paul was on trial. He at first was in Jerusalem, and then he was taken to Caesarea Maritima, and then eventually, as he stood before Felix, and then later Festus, and then later Agrippa II, it was finally decided that he would go to Rome. He appealed as a citizen to be taken to Rome. And so it was decided that we should sail for Italy. They delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort, and his name was Julius. So this centurion, he's going to make sure Paul and other prisoners are going to arrive in their proper destinations. Okay, so there's not just Paul, but other prisoners with them. That's an important detail. And it says that embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, now this is actually off the coast of southwestern Turkey, the name of the city right here, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia. When it's talking about Asia here, this is what you call Asia Minor, which is in the western part of Turkey. In this case, it's the southwestern part of Turkey. And it goes on and it says, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus. Okay, and you might remember that Aristarchus actually ran into Paul in Acts chapter 19, and in Acts chapter 20, he's mentioned. He's also mentioned at the end of the letter to the Colossians and at the end of the letter to Philemon. Okay, so he comes up a few times. And it goes on, Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. Okay, and you can go back to Acts 19 and 20 if you want to read a little bit more about him. The next day, we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly. Now, if you read the Old Testament, especially if you read the book of Ezekiel, you might remember the two great cities of Tyre and Sidon. Okay, and they're mentioned by the prophet Ezekiel, especially. You can go to Ezekiel 28 and forward. And so here they are, they're leaving this port, which is in modern day Lebanon, near Syria, and they're sailing towards what is now southwestern Turkey. And what's really interesting is Julius treated Paul kindly. This is really nice to see that this centurion he's taking care of Paul. He's treating him with kindness. It might remind you a little bit of Joseph. If you go all the way back to the book of Genesis and you remember Joseph, every time something went wrong with God's chesed with him, with the Lord's loving kindness, he came out on top of every situation. And even when he was imprisoned, he did well. So here's Paul. He seems to be doing pretty well, even as a prisoner. And so it says that Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus. So this is really amazing to think, wow, Julie, you could actually do this. You could actually let a prisoner leave and go to his friends and be cared for and then come back. This was a different type of a system here. Okay. And you're going to see that when we finally get to the last chapter, Paul, for a period of time, will be under house arrest, but we'll get into some of those details in chapter 28. And it says, in putting to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. Now, the mention of the winds is going to come up again and again in this chapter. The winds are going to get out of control in chapter 27 as they're going on this voyage. And when we had sailed across the sea, which is off of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra and Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria. Now, this is not a boat. This is a big ship sailing for Italy. Now, a lot of scholars will say that grains, especially wheat, was brought from Alexandria to Rome. Okay, so it was essentially brought from Egypt, and through the port of Alexandria, it was eventually made its way to Rome. So here's this massive vessel, massive ship sailing for Italy. Okay, and they're going to get on board this large ship. And it says, and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Snidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go on, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone or Salmon. Isn't that interesting? And coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens. Now, Fair Havens is the southern part of the island of Crete. It's in the middle of the island, near which was the city of Lasea. So you can see this boat, this large ship, is having problems because the winds are so strong. Okay. It's a massive ship. We're going to hear that there were something like 276 people on board the ship, not to mention all the grain that it was bringing, which was its main purpose. And so it says, so you can imagine they're off, they're right on the southern part of the island of Crete, okay? And it says, as much time had been lost and the voyage was already dangerous because the fast had already gone by. What are they talking about here? Sometimes they mention things in the narrative and they just kind of figure what they're talking about. What fast is being spoken of? Well, most scholars will say that what they're talking about is the fast on the Day of Atonement, the Day of Atonement. So they're guessing that this is the very end of September, possibly the beginning of October, when all these events are taking place. And so Paul advised them, saying, sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives. So here's Paul saying, guys, this is very dangerous right here. This doesn't look good. And so it's interesting that St. Luke mentions the Day of Atonement as well, but it does give us a ability to say, wow, Paul being a Jew he's still respecting the fast for the Day of Atonement. And now he's trying to warn those who are on the ship that this doesn't look good. Maybe we should stay here, okay? And look what happens. But the centurion paid more attention to the captain and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. Maybe he was thinking, well, these guys know what they're doing. They do this. So let's just stay on board. And so notice what's going to happen. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to put to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, looking northeast and southeast, and winter there. They could rest there. So, they're going to put out just for a very short voyage. They're going to sail from the middle of the island to corner of it, going towards Italy, and just, they'll rest it at a better place. That's going to be a big mistake. So here's what's going to happen. Verse 13, when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor, they picked up the anchor and sailed along Crete close inshore. So they're thinking, we got it. We're going to make it over to this better place to put the boat. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. So you can just imagine this very strong wind blowing the ship out to sea. I had an experience like this one time in my life where here in Southern California, we have these winds that we refer to as Santa Ana winds. And I took a raft out into the sea one morning. As I was doing so with a friend, the Santa Ana winds kicked in and it blew us about a mile off the shore. Fortunately, there was a boat that was coming by after a couple hours of being out in the middle of the sea, and it picked us up and rescued us. We let the air out of the raft and got on the boat and went back to the harbor. But you can imagine this here. Here's this massive wind, this northeaster pushing the boat out, and they can't get in. And there's no motor on the boat, so you need the wind for this massive. It's a ship, by the way, not a boat. I keep saying boat, but it's a large ship with over 200 people on board, and it's pushing it out to sea from the island of Crete. And it says, when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven. They're just being driven out by the wind. There's nothing they can do. And running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulties to secure the boat. After hoisting it up, they took measure to undergird the ship. So here it seems that they're lifting up a boat and putting it on the ship. Then fearing that they should run into the Syrtis. What is the Syrtis? What in the world is that? Well, these were actually sandbars, okay? And so if you're familiar with how sandbars can form near a shoreline, if you hit a sandbar with a boat, you're stuck. You can't go anywhere. And so they're afraid that they're going to hit these natural sandbars. And so you got to be careful. Okay. So fearing that they should run on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear and so were driven. And as we were violently storm tossed, they began next day to throw the cargo overboard. So they're starting to throw stuff overboard right now. And the third day, they cast out with their own hands the tackle of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars appeared for many a day, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. And as they had been long without food, Paul then came forward among them and said, men, you should have listened to me and should not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. I now bid you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you. I love these words. He's not angry, though, even though they didn't listen to him, but only the ship. So look at what he says. For this very night there stood by me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. Notice why does he word it this way? Well, he's speaking to Gentiles. And these Gentiles who are polytheistic, he's trying to help them understand that he belongs to the Lord and worships him. Okay. So an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid. Paul, you must stand before Caesar. So he's telling them, I'm gonna be standing before Caesar. I'm gonna be put on trial in Rome. And lo, God has granted you all those who sail with you. In other words, the angel's saying, you're going to go to Rome, you're going to stand on trial, you're going to appear before the court of Caesar, and all those who are with you on the boat are going to be safe as long as they don't get off the boat. And so you can just imagine what all these Gentiles are thinking as Paul is recounting all this to them. And he goes on and he says, "So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we shall have to run on some island." And what's really interesting here is he doesn't even know what the island is. It's the island of Malta. He just says that we're going to run on some island. In other words, boat is going to run up and it's going to be shipwrecked on that island. The ship is going to be shipwrecked on that island. And when the 14th night had come, as we were drifting across the Sea of Adria, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they shouted and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they sounded again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let out 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. Notice how big the ship is. These were large vessels. A lot of times you see artwork on this, and they've got Paul on this little tiny boat. And this is a massive ship with 270 people aboard, and it's filled with lots of grain coming from Alexandria, Egypt. They let out 4 anchors from the stern, and they prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the boat into the sea. So look at this. They're lowering a boat into the sea. They want to get out. They're thinking maybe we're going to drown. Under pretense of laying out the anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." In other words, you need to stay on the ship. And then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the boat and let it go. So they let the boat go. And as day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense without food, having taken nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take some food. It will give you strength, since not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." So notice how Paul is encouraging them during the midst of this horrific journey that they're on. And when he had said this, he took bread and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. And then they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all, notice the number, 276. Now that's a lot of people. There are some ancient manuscripts that give a lower number that say 76 or around 76. So you will find some variance. But even if you take the lower number of 76, you can imagine this is a ship intended to transport grain. It's a very large vessel. Okay. So 276 persons on board. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Can you just imagine? They're wasting all that wheat. And now, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to bring the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders, and then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a shoal, they ran the vessel aground. The bow struck and remained immovable, and the stern was broken up by the surf. Now, I've actually been to the island of Malta, and one of the things that impressed me about the island of Malta, especially just driving around the coast of this very tiny island, was how rocky the coastline was. And if you drive the island or travel a lot along the coast of Malta, you'll see that, wow, this is an unforgiving coast. You could see how a ship could easily get stuck in the rocks along the coast of Malta. And so it says the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners. Okay, they've got a bunch of prisoners aboard. Paul's one of them, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their purpose. Now, that was really something. It mentioned Julius and how kindly he was treating Paul. It doesn't say why, but There's something beautiful about this centurion here who takes such good care of Paul. When you go to Mark's gospel, of course, you have the story right at the foot of the cross that Mark recounts of the centurion who, at the moment of Jesus's death on the cross, he says, truly, this one was the Son of God. And so it goes on and it says, he ordered those who could swim to throw themselves overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all escaped to land. So every person escaped, but the ship was shipwrecked. And so I think a lot of times we don't appreciate how large this ship was. You know, when we think of Paul being shipwrecked, we think of maybe a boat. And I keep saying boat during this video because I'm forgetting that this is a large ship that they're on. So chapter 21 tells us about the journey to Rome. Okay. The decision was made. And so the ship is going to go about in a roundabout way along the coast of southwestern Turkey. And as I mentioned, the centurion Julius, he treated Paul with great kindness. And there's something beautiful about that. You know, he's a centurion, Paul's a prisoner, but he's treating him with the greatest kindness, even allowing him to take leave and basically saving his life at the end of the chapter. And what's really interesting is the rough waters that the ship faces. Paul's warning them. He's saying, you know, let's just keep the ship here. Don't try to leave the port of Fairhaven. And what do? They don't listen to Paul. They pick up the anchors, and the ship is unable to go back to any port. It just floats out in the sea for over 14 days until they finally hit the island of Malta. So it's underlining something beautiful about the journey. You know, they're going through the midst of a storm, but the Lord is guiding Paul, even as a prisoner. Even in this most difficult moment of his life, he's guiding Paul, and Paul is giving, you know, advice to others, encouraging others, and he's the prisoner in this difficult situation. So there's something we can learn from here that, you know, when we have trials, when we're in the midst of a difficulty, when we're in the midst of a storm, we can ask the Lord to give us direction and to give us direction so that we can help others who are also caught up in the storm. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, my brothers and sisters, may the Lord pour out his blessing upon the entire church.